Welcome back, because today gets weird in the best way. We're talking tiny steps, marriage fights, trauma, and why avoiding conflict just makes it grow. Which is a very aggressive way to say, please stop pretending the problem is not there. That part hit me hard because he keeps saying the fix is embarrassingly small. Not a life overhaul, just one honest sentence and maybe not being a disaster tonight. That's almost insulting in how practical it is. Right, like people want a revelation and he hands them a checklist. But the point is that tiny wins rebuild competence. And if you are drowning, competence is basically oxygen. That's why the whole take the smallest voluntary step thing matters so much. Because the goal is not motivation, it's momentum. Though I do wonder if people sometimes use small step as an excuse to stay tiny forever. Oh, absolutely, and then they call it healing. Bro, that is not healing, that is sophisticated hiding. The scary part is he's saying the step has to be voluntary, not forced. That matters because forced change usually just makes you rebel internally. Which is hilarious and tragic because then you become your own prison guard. I think that's why exposure therapy felt so central here. You don't conquer fear by announcing victory, you inch toward it until your body learns otherwise. And that is such a brutal idea because fear does not care about your opinion. Fear is not sitting there like, reasonable point. Fear is a landlord. Yeah, and it keeps raising the rent until you move. What I liked is how he linked that to therapy and relationships at the same time. Because the same pattern shows up when people avoid the hard conversation with a partner. They think silence is peace, but it is just delayed fire. Delayed fire is such a good phrase, I hate that it's true. The marriage stuff got intense fast, though. Especially the idea that one person needs to actually hear the other one, not just win. Which sounds obvious until you are the one being blamed at 9 p.m. Exactly, nobody turns into Aristotle when they're hungry and tired. Hunger is the true marriage counselor. Honestly, it might be. His whole point about scheduling conflict like a meeting was wild but useful. Home becomes chaos when you treat every issue like an emergency ambush. And then both people start associating each other with bad news. That is the fastest way to poison affection. I also thought the "you have to listen 90 minutes a week" line was hilarious. It sounded like a relationship tax. But maybe he's right that if you don't listen, you just pay later with interest. And probably in divorce court, which is the most expensive listening session imaginable. The final bill is always ugly. What did you make of the part about women being more threat-sensitive? I thought it was a useful generalization, but also dangerous if people get lazy with it. Because then somebody hears a stereotype and stops thinking. Exactly, but the underlying point is that one partner often spots danger earlier. And the cost of ignoring that is you miss the signal until it's way bigger. That part felt like business logic sneaking into marriage. Which is honestly how a lot of marriages survive, with spreadsheets and resentment. Romantic, devastating, and true. What really landed was the idea that conflict delayed becomes conflict multiplied. That line is basically a warning label for every passive-aggressive relationship ever. And he's not even saying fight more, he's saying resolve faster. Which is a huge difference because the goal is not drama, it's clarity. People confuse the two all the time, like shouting is honesty. Shouting is often just confusion with volume. The childhood trauma section took it somewhere darker, though. The bedroom floor metaphor is brutal because it makes trauma feel like geography. Like you are just walking through life trying not to fall through old holes. And the point is, you can map the holes before you can ever fill them. That feels painfully realistic for anyone with repetitive patterns. Especially the idea that what looks like a boss problem might actually be a father problem. Or a marriage problem wearing a different outfit. He kept coming back to how old structures get reused in adult life. Which is why people react so hard to things that seem small on the surface. They're not reacting to the sentence, they're reacting to the memory behind it. Exactly. And then tears show up because the old framework has to break. That's such an uncomfortable idea that tears are a kind of reset. Humiliating reset, but still a reset. I thought the bully section was one of the strongest parts. Because it explains why some people keep attracting the same treatment. Not because they deserve it, obviously, but because they get marked early. Right, and then that response can become a stable trait if nobody interrupts it. Which is such a grim sentence to hear out loud. But it also means the pattern is learnable, which is hopeful. That's the recurring theme here, actually. You can learn to name the problem faster, and naming it changes everything. Even when the problem is you, which is always annoying. The ego hates this episode. It should, honestly. I also liked the part about going to your boss with a solution, not just a complaint. That's one of those things that sounds like corporate advice but is actually just adulthood. If you can specify the target, everything gets easier. And that's true in marriages, too, because vague pain is impossible to fix. The whole "what do you want me to say" thing was great for that reason. It turns accusation into translation, which is a much better use of everybody's nervous system. Then he goes all the way into hell, betrayal, and the bottom of human behavior. That turn was intense because he basically says the worst evil is betrayal. And that makes sense, because trust is the whole skeleton of relationships. If trust goes, everything else collapses around it. The childhood abuse section was especially heavy, because it is the deepest betrayal, and there is no cute language for that. What stood out to me is that he refuses the idea of monsters from another planet. That is the uncomfortable part, that ordinary people can become horrifying. That's the part nobody wants to sit with, which is why his obsession with truth matters so much here. Not truth as a slogan, truth as the only thing that lets you stop lying to yourself. And that connects right back to the tiny step idea. Because truth often starts as one bearable action, not one grand epiphany, which is annoyingly humble for such a huge topic. So if you strip all the drama away, the episode is basically saying this: face one thing honestly. Then do the next small thing and do not run from the conversation. That is simple and somehow still the hardest thing in the world. All right, we're going to leave it there before we all start therapy on the floor. We'll pick this up in the next one because the dark stuff keeps going. Episode 3 gets into what happens when the cost of avoidance finally explodes. Welcome back. This episode is all about tiny steps and gigantic inner messes. And somehow the idea is that one honest move beats 1,000 dramatic promises, which is rude because everyone wants the cinematic transformation. The whole point is that people usually need traction, not inspiration. Right, but traction sounds painfully unsexy when your life is on fire. Yeah, nobody wants the motivational poster version of recovery. He keeps pushing the smallest reliable action because competence has to start somewhere. Like if your life is wrecked, the goal is not brilliance, it is something doable, which is deeply offensive to the ego. Totally, because the ego wants a thunderbolt and gets a tiny habit instead. But that tiny habit is what begins rebuilding trust in yourself. That part actually hits hard because people act like confidence appears before action. It usually does not, and that is the betrayal nobody wants to hear. Confidence is basically receipts from previous behavior. And if you have no receipts, you do not get to cosplay as stable. The therapy piece is interesting too, because he treats feeling safe as earned. Not as a mood, but as a skill you practice. Exactly, and the exposure idea is just gradual contact with the thing you avoid. Which sounds easy until your nervous system starts acting like a fire alarm. A very dramatic fire alarm with a huge victim complex. But that alarm can be retrained if you stop treating every wobble like apocalypse. The marriage stuff is where it gets messy, because this is no longer abstract. Oh, it gets gloriously unglamorous real fast. He is basically saying relationships need rules because feelings alone will not run the house. Which is wild because people keep trying to run marriages like poetry readings. And then they are shocked when the poetry starts throwing dishes. The point about not dumping every issue at night is actually practical genius. Because tired people do not solve problems, they manufacture new ones. Hungry people especially become philosophers of destruction. That is so true. One missed meal and suddenly everyone is the villain. He keeps returning to listening because unresolved problems metastasize when ignored. And listening is not passive there. It is how you find the actual issue. But he also says you have to be willing to hear that you are the problem sometimes, which is the least popular podcast advice ever given. Still, that is the hinge. If you can be corrected, you can change. If not, you just keep bleeding on everybody else. I also thought the bully victim part was important because it explains repeat dynamics. Some people learn to spot threat everywhere because they have been trained by experience. And then every disagreement feels like an attack, even when it is not. Which means one person is trying to solve a problem and the other is filing a police report. That is absurdly accurate. He is pretty relentless about saying truth has to be mutual or the whole thing collapses. And that mutuality is what makes commitment risky and useful at the same time. Because you are basically agreeing to stay in the room while the ugly stuff comes out. That is the deal. And the deal only works if both people keep faith. The trauma part gets darker when he starts talking about the bottom of the hole. Some wounds do not just hurt, they rewrite the whole map of danger. And then you keep walking around the same pit forever. He uses betrayal almost like the deepest layer, which makes sense and also does not feel fair. Nothing about betrayal feels fair. That is kind of the definition. What is unsettling is his insistence that evil is not always exotic. Yeah, that is the brutal part, because ordinary people can become horrifying. That is why the Auschwitz question matters so much to him. He is not trying to make monsters feel distant, he is trying to make them legible. Which is terrifying, because legible means possible, and possible means relevant. Nobody enjoys that realization, which is probably why it is useful. And that is where the whole episode lands for me, honestly. Not at hope exactly, but at responsibility. You do the small thing, tell the truth, and stop pretending you are above repair. Which is a very rude sentence to hear if you were hoping for a miracle. But it is also strangely comforting because repair is at least a path. And a path is better than standing in the dark and calling it destiny. All right, that is us for today. We took the scenic route through marriage, trauma, and the abyss, so that feels sufficient. Episode 3 is where the avoidance bill comes due, and that one gets expensive fast. Welcome back, and today we are in the weird little zone where tiny habits meet giant damage. The pitch is simple. Stop trying to fix your whole life and do one survivable thing. Which sounds insulting until you realize it is probably the first honest advice most people get. That is the part I keep coming back to because it is almost offensively unglamorous. Nobody wants a revolution that starts with making the bed badly. But that is exactly why it works, because you can actually do it tomorrow. And once you can do one thing, the whole personality stops feeling like a tomb. Peterson keeps circling this idea that competence is built, not declared. Which is annoying if you are addicted to epiphanies, because it ruins the fantasy. Yeah, the universe does not care that you had a dramatic realization at 2 a.m. It cares whether you can repeat the smallest useful action when you do not feel like it. That repetition part is where people get mad because it sounds almost insultingly basic. Right, like, thank you, Professor, I am cured by doing one email. But the point is that confidence usually follows evidence, and evidence comes from action. And once you start stacking tiny wins, your nervous system stops acting like the sky is falling. That is the brutal part, because it means despair is often partly a logistics problem. Which is such a rude thing to tell a depressed person, but also may be true. Not just logistics, though, because the fear is real and the body remembers. That is where the exposure therapy piece gets interesting, because he is basically saying, make contact with the thing. Not all at once, obviously, because that would be chaos dressed up as bravery. But enough to prove the fear is not the same thing as doom. That is actually a huge distinction, because people confuse alarm with prophecy all the time. The brain is a sensationalist journalist with no editorial standards. It really is, and then it writes headlines like, "You are definitely ruined forever." The therapy answer is basically, no, you are just untrained in this one domain. I like that because it restores dignity without pretending the wound is imaginary. Yeah, it says you are not broken beyond use. You are just underdeveloped in a specific direction. And that is a much less romantic story, but it is more useful. What did you make of the whole idea that tears are not just emotion, but a reset? I mean, that is a wild sentence if you hear it outside the context of actual pain. But I get the logic, because sometimes the old structure has to collapse before anything new can fit. And nobody likes that because collapse feels humiliating, especially people who built their whole identity around being composed. Which is why the conversation moved so hard into marriage, because intimacy is where all that gets exposed. His argument is basically that couples keep trying to win instead of learn. And winning is such a stupid goal in a marriage, which is why everybody tries it. The real win is shortening the gap between hurt and honest speech. That part felt very practical to me, especially the whole say what you want thing, because people love to complain while also refusing to define the target. Just vibes, but with legal consequences. Exactly. And then everyone acts shocked when the same fight returns next Tuesday. I think the strongest point he made is that delayed conflict does not disappear, it compounds. Which is why the little rules matter, like not ambushing each other when you are exhausted. People treat that like romance is supposed to survive on raw mood alone. No, romance needs scheduling, groceries, and a little humility. And maybe that is the shocking thing, that love is partly administration. He keeps saying the home is basically a small business, which sounds cold until you sit with it. Then you realize it is only cold if you were hoping chaos was a personality trait. The point is just structure prevents resentment from becoming the only language. And listening, real listening, becomes the way you keep that structure honest. Though I do think he pushes the gender stuff in a pretty stereotyped way. Even if you bracket the stereotypes, the core idea is still useful. People notice different things. One person spots the threat, the other spots the blind spot, and both can be wrong. That is marriage in one sentence, honestly. And then he takes it darker, into trauma, bullying, and betrayal. That whole holes in the floor image is doing a lot of work. It is because it says trauma is not just pain, it is an unfilled failure in the map. And if the hole is early enough, you keep falling into it with adult tools that were never built for it. That is why he keeps saying the past gets replayed in bosses, partners, and kids. You are not just arguing with the person in front of you, you are arguing with old architecture. And that is exhausting, because one fight suddenly has 6 hidden fights inside it. Exactly, and if you do not name that, you keep calling every new person the villain. The bully victim piece was especially sharp, because it explains why some people overread threat everywhere. Once that template locks in, every disagreement starts looking like domination. Then your spouse says one normal sentence and suddenly you are in a courtroom drama. Exactly, and the defense attorney is your inner child with a terrible filing system. What I respect is that he does not stop at diagnosis. He keeps pushing toward responsibility. Even when he talks about terrible things, the answer is still truth, love, beauty, and action. That is the only part that feels almost spiritual because it treats repair as a moral task. And then he goes all the way down to betrayal, which is where the whole thing gets medieval. Because the deepest fear is not just pain, it is that the person you trust is the wolf. That is why the marriage vow matters in his framing, because it promises no flight when the ugly truth arrives. Which is terrifying, but also kind of beautiful if both people mean it. It is beautiful in the same way a bridge is beautiful because it survives weight. That is such a good line, and also such a non-romantic line. But maybe that is the whole episode, really, that survival is the precondition for meaning. You do not get transformation by staring at your suffering like a poet in a storm. You get it by doing one small thing, admitting one real thing, and not running away. That feels like a good place to land because the advice is harsh but surprisingly hopeful. Small steps, honest words, and less theater around your own pain. Which is rude, but at least it is workable. All right, that is us for today. We went from making the bed to the bottom of hell, which is a pretty normal Tuesday for us. Episode 3 is where avoidance starts charging interest, and that gets ugly fast. We will get into what happens when the bill arrives and nobody wants to look at it.